Skills have become the currency of 21st century societies. Those with the right skills never had the kind of life chances they have today. But those without those skills have also never paid a greater price than they pay today. And the difficulty with this currency of skills is that there is no central bank that can print it. You can't inherit it. And actually it has a quite high degree of inflation. What I want to do this morning is talk you through to some of those dynamics and actually focus on those education systems around the world that have made the most progress in getting us where we need to be. I want to look at some of the changes in the demand for skills. Yeah. Some of you have seen this cover of The Economist. Now, 50% of the jobs that we know today can be done by machines, computers. And the dilemma for teachers and educators is that the kind of things that are easiest to teach, easiest to test, are precisely those things that are easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. Those are the jobs that are disappearing. And this is not just about robots taking over whole factories. The best example is actually this one. You have a car that is going 1 million kilometers through the dense traffic of San Francisco without a driver. Ask your taxi driver tomorrow what this means to him or her. Those jobs are changing fundamentally. It's new types of skills that are actually important. Think about augmented reality. We're able to bring in the world's most advanced knowledge into everything we do in real time. And again, that means that the modern world no longer rewards us for what we know. No? I guess Google knows everything. The world rewards us for what we can do with what we know. That's become the big differentiator. That's what we need to, and there's a lot more to come. You think about 3D printing, synthetic biology. There's going to be lots of changes that are actually going to impact on our lives. Golden and Katz have described this as the race between technology and education. If you think to the time before the Industrial Revolution, neither technology and education had a big impact on the large majority of people. But then came the Industrial Revolution, and what did it do? It made technology racing ahead of the capacities of people. For some, it was great, huge opportunity, but the majority of people actually were left behind. We saw a huge amount of social pain during those years. But then, governments came in and invented the concept of universal public schooling. And that brought people ahead of technology and created generations of prosperity. But if we're honest, since then we have actually seen very limited progress in education. We have built more of the same schools, but we are now confronted with a digital revolution that once again puts technology ahead of the capacities of people. And again, we are seeing the same phenomena as in the Industrial Revolution. You're seeing, on the one hand, graduates coming out of university, spend lots of time there, having difficulties finding a job. And at the very same time, employers telling us they cannot find the people with the skills they need. So the question is, if we continue with what we are doing, we're going to see increasing social pain again. The question is how we can get education once again ahead of technology. So that's really what I'm going to talk about this morning. And obviously, technology itself can be a hugely powerful driver for education. Technology can amplify any teaching, great teaching, even though technology is never going to replace poor teaching. Let's keep that in mind as well. Think about some of those possibilities. Why should students today keep up with a textbook that was printed 2 years ago and maybe designed 10 years ago, when they can have access in real time to the world's most advanced knowledge? We can support the kind of pedagogies that, scientists have dreamt for generations. Personalized learning, inquiry-based pedagogies, collaborative workspace for students. We can suddenly connect teachers and schools in ways we couldn't do before. I just came back from China yesterday. One of the things they do really well is they have a platform where teachers can upload their lesson plans. And the trick is, the more other teachers download your lessons, use your lessons, improve your lessons, criticize your lessons, the more you gain in prestige, the more people look at you with respect. And at the end of the school year, when your principal will ask, They will not only evaluate you whether you've done a good job with your own children, but what contribution did you make to the profession? How is your status in the profession? Sharing and collaboration. There are other tools when you look at the pedagogies, experiential learning. Many of our children may never have the chance to work in a laboratory, try out things, to experiment. They can do that with technology, hands-on pedagogies, social skills. One of the most rising demands for skills. That's the dream. But let's come back to reality. We actually measured the skills of people through our PISA tests. That's the vertical axis here. And here you have an index of the intensity of technology use in education systems. And if we would realize the stream of technology, you'd see a relationship that starts here. People who don't use technology don't do so well. And then, the more people actually capitalize on technologies, the better the learning outcomes. But the reality looks like this. People with no use of technology don't do so well. If they use it somehow, they do quite well. But here, things actually get worse. Why is that? You'll find the answer when you think about how we currently use technology in our classrooms. Essentially, we have 21st century learners. We have 20th century teaching and teachers. And we have a 19th century work organization in our schooling system. And actually, for every good example of technology use, you're going to find 5 ones where actually technology makes things actually worse. There's a lot of really hard work that we need to do in school systems actually to realize the potential of technology as a lever to improve learning. Part of the answer is pretty clear. You can actually look at this when you ask teachers, where do they feel they need better skills? And when you do this, in virtually every country, technology skills, a workplace that is technology intensive, come out right on top of the list, of the wish list of teachers in terms of professional development. We've got to do a lot better to equip more people with better skills to collaborate, compete, and connect in the education profession if we want to realize the potential of technology. But let's do all of this a bit more systematically. Let's see actually who's getting this right. Every 3 years, we look at the knowledge and skills of people, students, 15-year-olds in education systems. And then we look at how well do countries come out. And if you're in East Asia, whether you look at creative skills, problem-solving skills, mathematics, here's mathematics, those systems typically do really well. You have countries in Europe, Finland, and so on, also coming out quite well. Canada and North America. But then you already get to the yellow part. These systems, just do so-so. And then to the red part, where things look really bad in terms of being prepared for the 21st century. We have put sort of a bottom line here. This is sort of where students lack the most elementary skills. And don't be mistaken that this is just an issue, for countries like Malaysia, Mexico, and so on. Even in the wealthiest countries, take the United States, you have about a quarter of Americans who do not even have the most basic skills to use, access, manage, integrate information. Cesar was telling us we live in this flat world where, where everybody can collaborate, compete, and connect. That's actually true for those who have those kinds of foundation skills. But in the wealthiest country, you have a quarter of people who have just no chance to live in this flat world. And you can get a lot worse. There are many, many countries actually below that threshold currently. Think about Ghana, the last one on the list. What if Ghana would be able to fix that problem? Not reach sort of the world standard in education, the Finlands and the Shanghais and so on, but just give everybody the basic skills. Actually, you talk about 40 times of Ghana's current GDP. That's the economic value over the lifetime of today's school students they would generate if actually they'd have those kinds of skills. You can suddenly see the high cost of low education performance. Think about Brazil, another country. They do much better than Ghana, but still you talk about 7 times the wealth of Brazil. Where does Brazil get its money from currently? Selling raw material. You can live off that for so long. But in fact, the lost value of the economy, because the country doesn't reap the potential of its people, it's many, many times larger than that. And again, you can go back sort of to the better performing countries. here, and you look at the United States, and also there, you can find a huge economic value. Still talk about 1.5 times the current GDP, or about 27 trillion US dollars. That's, again, the high cost of low performance. But I want to bring a second dimension to this, and this is about equity. In some countries, social background, where kids are born, is a huge driver of success in education. But we see other countries where that is much more limited. When you look at those two dimensions, everybody wants to be here where performance is good and all students succeed. Nobody wants to be here where performance is poor and there are large social disparities, it's obvious. Some people say, you know, if you want to do well on average, you have to sort of compromise equity. Only some people can succeed, it's all about talent. Other people say, well, you know, focus on equity and give up on quality. But the interesting thing is when you look at the evidence, actually, you see that there is no policy trade-off between quality and equity in education. The countries that do well in education on average typically also succeed to deliver high quality for all of their students from all social backgrounds. So what's behind that? The first idea we typically hear is all about money. Put more money into education. But you know, the size of the dot is now how much countries spend per student. And if money would be the answer to every problem, you'd find all the large bubbles at the top and all the small bubbles at the bottom. And that's not what you see. Spending per student explains, you know, less than 20% of the performance variation across the countries that you see here. And also, we have to be honest, over time, over the last 15 years, we have increased education spending by 40% on average across countries. And actually, if you ask yourself what we have seen in return for that, it's been pretty limited. Now, another popular explanation for this is it's all about culture. But, you know, if culture would be the answer to this, you would see this picture year after year, day after day, static. But that's not what you see. Look at this. You know, this was where Chile was in the year 2003. And this is where Turkey was. But then between 2003 and 2012, Chile was able to lift its performance, raise this performance of students. But you look at Chile, at Turkey, and you can see over the same period, Turkey was not only lifting their performance, but also closing a large part of the achievement gap. And this tells you, you know, two countries starting out from the same point in a similar context make very different levels of progress depending on what they do. This is about policy. You can look at Shanghai, moving up further, Singapore. Most of the world's most advanced education system keep improving. My country, Germany, starting out here, moving upwards, but most importantly, addressing some of the blatant social disparities in the education system successfully. Or Italy, it's another of the examples, moving upwards, moving rightwards. Poland, one of the biggest success stories, dramatically lifting the performance of education. Or you can see Portugal moving a bit backwards in equity, but at least giving young people a better quality education than they had in the past. Dramatic improvement is possible. The sad part of the story is that this is about it. For the rest of the countries, things have been pretty much the same. You can look in the second set of countries now. Brazil would be another of those success stories at the low end of the spectrum. But you know, you don't find so many. We got to do a lot better on this in the future. Poverty is a big driver of performance. Have a look at this. These are the 10% of Mexican children from the poorest, the 10% poorest kids. And they do less well than the 10% of the kids from the wealthiest backgrounds. That's what you expect. But that relationship looks quite different across countries. If you come from a poor neighborhood in Chile, you do actually worse than if you come from a poor neighborhood in Mexico. If you come from a wealthy background in Chile, you do better. So two kids from the same social background come out very differently depending on where they go to school. And you can do this across every country. You can see how huge the variability amongst similar kids is depending on where they go to class. The country where you go to school matters a lot more for you than the social class where you come from. And you can do this across countries. Now you can see, for example, here, the 10% most disadvantaged children in Shanghai. And they typically have parents who have no education at all. who work as construction workers in some of the kind of buildings. Those poor kids get an education that is actually better than that of the wealthiest kids in some of the world's richest nations. This shows us poverty isn't destiny. We can do a lot better in giving more people better skills. So the question, of course, is how do we do that? And I want to share some lessons of what we have learned with this. And I'm going to order those lessons based on their importance. Now, how much difference do those policies and practice actually make for success? But also, to be honest, keep into account the social and economic cost of educational reform. Everybody wants to do things that are easy to do and very important. We're all in the same boat. Nobody wants to spend money on things that are maybe not so important and actually perhaps quite hard to do. But don't think that there is nothing in this quarter. Think about the huge amount of money that we have spent in most countries on reducing class sizes. If you actually go to the most advanced education system, you'll consistently find that whenever they have to make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, they go for the better teacher. In large parts of the world, we have gone for the smaller class. And that is a good example, where lots of resources are invested in things that are not obviously making a difference. I want to talk about some of the things that are really important, but hard to do. And I put technology into this corner as well. We've got to do a lot better on this, and we can always pick up some low-hanging fruits, things that are not so important, but maybe easy to do. And I'm going to talk you through some of the elements in this equation. And I start with something that sounds trivial, but is really important. And that is the commitment to universal achievement that education systems actually have. Of course, every politician talks about how important education is. But when you actually look at, how do we prioritize education over other things? What you see in a country like China is that parents and grandparents are going to invest their last resources into their future. And that's the education of their children. While if you go to Europe or the United States, we have already spent the money of our children for our consumption today. That's the debt crisis we are currently in. This is a matter of those kinds of priorities. But the story gets much more interesting. Once we asked the children in Pisa a very simple question. We asked them, what do you think makes you successful in mathematics? And when we asked this question to American children or some children in Europe, not everywhere, but in some countries, the answer we typically got was, oh, that's very clear. It's all about talent. If I'm not born as a genius, I'm not going to study mathematics. I go to study something else. If you ask that same question to a Singaporean kid or many other countries in Asia, 9 out of 10 children will tell you, if I study really, really hard, I trust my teacher is going to help me, and I'm going to be successful. And this is a good mirror of the education system across countries. In large parts of the world, education is just a giant sorting machine. You put somewhere in and you come somewhere out and nobody really cares. Tracking, streaming students, all of those kinds of devices. In the most advanced education systems, every student counts. There is no tolerance for failure. Every student is put under the same high level of expectations. The second point I want to mention is gateways and instructional systems. And I actually show you a couple of data points on this. The hard part for educators today is, in this fast-changing world, what do we teach young people? And there are lots of discussions going on. What is the relevance of knowledge? Disciplinary knowledge, but also some of the more synthetic new fields of knowledge. What about skills? Using what we know. And this is perhaps the most kind of disputed field. It's about character. And there is lots of discussion about it. Now, some educators telling us, well, schools should not get involved in character. I'm very skeptical about it, and often what you find is that those people who say those things send their own children to the private schools that actually precisely distinguish themselves on those character qualities. They may also do better on math and science, but what they really do is that they foster things like curiosity, courage, resilience. Those kinds of dimensions. And the question I think we should be asking ourselves is, to what extent do we want to leave this for the very few who have the fortune, or to what extent should this be part of the education system? I want to sort of touch on some of the elements here that are involved here. The first thing is knowledge. When you think about knowledge, you think about history, mathematics, science, language, and so on. We have traditional academic disciplines. But there's a lot of research out there that shows us actually we are today able to construct much more sort of systematic knowledge maps to actually think about content knowledge in much more innovative ways. And this is the hard question, every educator needs to ask themselves. The first question is all about, what's about the practical use of knowledge? I want to give you an example. Think about how much you teach your school children trigonometry or calculus. It's what dominates our mathematics curricula. I asked myself that question, and I only found the answer when I actually mapped curricula for about 200 years. 200 years ago, we used those knowledge to measure the size of our fields and the kind of things around us, and that was what was really important. But we have never been able to get rid of this and look at the kind of new things that became important. Think about the role of mathematics in today's society. What's the most dominant feature of mathematical thinking in today's world? It's all about probabilities, risks, likelihood. It's about statistics. We teach very little of this. We have crowded out the space in curricula with this. So thinking much harder about the disciplinary and practical use of knowledge is important. But it's not the only part of the story. We also think, what is the cognitive value of what we teach? Now, teaching is not only to enable people to do something, but we need to think carefully about the kind of cognitive attributes. And then there are judgments that, societies make, cultures make about what they think is important. And this is where we need to get much, much further beyond the kind of content. I want to give you some examples. Traditional, we take a big problem in school, we break it up into smaller and smaller pieces, and then we train students how to solve those pieces. That's how we work in education. But what's actually more important today is the capacity of people to connect the dots where the next innovation is coming from. Finland has now an interesting approach. It's basically introduced a cross-curricular curriculum. Basically bringing together the science and the history and the language teacher to work together on problems that transcend disciplinary boundaries. It's a huge challenge. Nobody knows whether this is going to go well because it's putting huge challenges into teachers. But that's where the future is going to lie. Can students connect the dots where the next idea is going to come from? Not can they work in disciplinary silos. Design thinking. Innovation is not just about, you having a crazy idea, a creative idea. Innovation is a very, very systematic process. Getting people to think through those processes is important. Information literacy. Again, a generation ago, when you didn't know a problem, you went to an encyclopedia, you find the answer, and you can trust the answer to be true. Today, you go on Google, you find 27,000 answers, and nobody's telling you what is right and wrong. The question is, do you have the compass and the navigation skills to find your own way through an increasingly complex, ambiguous, volatile world? And that's the test of truth for young people. Information literacy, digital literacy, global literacy. To what extent are people able to see the world through different lenses, different perspectives, understand different cultures, ideas? That is really about knowledge in a modern way. I want to give you just an example from our PISA test. You can teach mathematics in very, very different ways. One way in which you can teach mathematics is to focus on what we call word problems, very popular in Iceland. What this means is you take basically simple mathematics, put it in the form of a text, and then you train students how to solve those texts. I must tell you, when I was a student, that's the mathematics I hated most. All you had to do is extract the numbers from the problem, solve the problem, give it to the teacher, and you're done. And actually, what's interesting, you look to a country like Shanghai, the world's education leader in education, they don't teach math in this way. Very few word problems, very few practical problems in the context of Shanghai. So how do the kids in Shanghai learn mathematics? Well, actually, have a look at the next slide. They actually focus on conceptual understanding. They don't worry whether students can solve all sorts of practical problems. They worry whether students have understood the foundations of the disciplines. Do they know what mathematical reasoning is? Can they think like a scientist? Can they draw evidence-based conclusions? That's the focus. And the kids in Iceland, they don't learn in this way. So you can actually see huge differences in the instructional systems across countries. Very different ways in which knowledge is being implemented in classroom today. We have to learn from those kinds of differences in much better ways. Briefly about skills. You can construct, everybody has their own lists. It's about creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, innovation. We heard that about today. One aspect that I want to really put up at front is collaboration. I put this right at the center. Connecting, collaborating with people. And then, let's have a look at character qualities. That's the real tough part of this. To what extent do we want to build those things into our school systems? Think about empathy, resilience, curiosity, courage, leadership. And this is not about new school subjects. This is about, how do we integrate those kinds of character qualities in today's disciplinary context. Some people say that's a nice to have thing, it's not really central and important, but actually it's quite predictive for success. Look at college completion in the United States. Cognitive skills predict whether you complete college. Now that's what you expect. People who are smarter are more likely to complete college. But those kinds of social emotional skills or character qualities are actually as predictive for people's success in completing college. Or you look at happiness. This is another example. Actually, this is interesting. Your cognitive skills are not related to happiness at all. You can feel happy if you're stupid. You can feel happy if you're smart. But actually, you look at the social and emotional skills, and you can see actually they're very powerful predictors of people's sense of well-being. So character qualities are not just a nice to have, the sort of ice on the cake. They are really about basically some integral parts of people's success in life. And we have lots of more of those kinds of data which actually highlights those kinds of things. And obviously, good teachers have always done those things. But the question is again, how can we build this into the instructional system? Last point I want to make is really about metacognition. This is about learning to learn, self-awareness, self-regulation, self-reflection, and so on. And again, we can actually see that those attributes are very powerful predictor for people's success. First of all, the day you leave school, there is no teacher anymore. Your success in life is going to depend on whether you have the capacity and the motivation to continue learning throughout your own life. And this is precisely what those metacognitive abilities are about, helping you to make an effective learner. And we have tested this actually. Here you can see the skills, the performance of education system. Here you can see in the field of mathematics an index of the extent to which students were confident they could solve problems they had never seen before. And you can see there's quite an important relationship among the two. No surprise. Students in Shanghai are not only doing really well, but they're also able to invest that level of effort because they have the confidence they can conquer the unknown. So again, very, very important dimensions. The part where I want to focus a bit more on is the capacity at the point of delivery. Now, the quality of education can never exceed the quality of teachers and teaching. That's pretty obvious for anyone. And you can see that nicely in this chart. Now, we asked teachers around the world what they considered good teaching. And actually, what is surprising, the variation across countries is very limited. Most teachers in most classrooms have a very good sense about modern pedagogy, student-centered learning. Students should allow to think to solutions, to practical problems before I, as a teacher, tell them. Everything that we know about good pedagogy is what most teachers in most countries, in most classrooms, think is good pedagogy. But the flip side is that what they actually do in classrooms is very different. Have a look at this. This is actually what happens in classrooms. Think about, the rise in social skills, the recognition of the importance of social skills by teachers. And then you see only about half of the classrooms give that any attention on a regular basis. Now, a bit of variation on this. Brazil is a country that's doing that well, Norway, Chile, and so on. But in most countries, actually, we see that actually students do not have many opportunities to work collaboratively. Even technology. You get into many schools and you see students doing exactly the work individually as they would do in a normal classroom. Using the potential of technology. Or think about project-based learning. Students work at least for 1 week. Doing sort of in-depth learning happens actually in less than 30% of the cases. So we have to ask ourselves, if this is so endemic in the system, what is the barrier that prevents people from doing what they themselves know is right? And the answer is, it's about developing teaching much more as a profession. It's about getting the right people into the job. No? It's very clear. If you hire the wrong teacher, you're ending up with 40 years of poor teaching. No? That's a lot of issues. No? It's about supporting them in their continued professional development. It's about retaining and recognizing good teaching, providing perspectives for careers, for growth. No? And it's about the social value of teaching. I want to sort of show you just one data slide on that part. No? This is about the share of teachers who think that society values their job. Now, if you're in Malaysia, in Singapore, Korea, Finland, Abu Dhabi, and so on, most teachers think, I'm doing a job that society really respects, really values. But if you get to France or the Slovak Republic, it's 5 in 100. Every day, teachers go out to do a job that they don't think society respects. Now you can say, oh, maybe the French and the Slovak teachers are just complaining. But in fact, you can see that those results line up quite well with the actual performance of education systems. Countries where there is a higher degree of teachers' confidence actually also are doing better when it comes to mathematics. So it's quite important to get the social value of this right. And this has a lot less to do with teacher salaries than you might think, and it has a lot more to do with the way we organize the work of teachers, the way we invest in collaborative professional development. I'll show you a couple of data slides on this. This is the frequency with teachers collaborate. For example, teaching teachers jointly as a class. The more that happens, the more effective teachers themselves feel they are. Observe other teachers' classrooms, providing feedback to other teachers. It's not about money, this is about work practices. And you can see the more teachers do those things, the more they feel they do a great job in school. Engage in joint activities, take part in collaborative professional development. Those are the things that really make a difference. And there are very few countries getting that right at the moment. When you think about sort of informal exchange and collaboration, that happens a lot in countries. They're sharing resources, conferences, and so on. Teachers are generally very social people. But when you look at the kind of things that really make a difference, I talked about team teaching, collaborative professional development, joint activities, and most importantly, classroom activities. Well, if you go to Japan, Japan is great in this. Teachers typically prepare their lessons together, they evaluate their lessons. There's a strong culture of collaboration. But in much of the rest of the world, we are not very good in getting the good ideas out of a classroom into the system. We may get ideas top down into the classrooms, but we are not good at mobilizing, sharing knowledge. And this is precisely what matters, according to teachers. It's just not happening at a strong scale. What can we do about this? Well, what we have found is actually 4 levers that really make a difference. The first has to do with, reconfiguring educators. Not just sending one teacher in a classroom, but using the teacher where they are best. Building careers, building into collaborative planning and the kind of things I talked about. Regrouping learners. We have to understand that learning is not a place, but an activity. Finding ways, how learners can learn at home, at school, mixing students of different ages. There are lots of things that can really make a difference. Rescheduling learning, getting rid of the kind of fixed blocks of learning time, making learning a lot more flexible. And the hardest part is about the pedagogical side. That's really where you have to invest. In most of these things, you don't have to spend money. It's about doing things differently. That part, is hard to do. I recognize this, but it's also still very, very important. Last point really that is important is, incentive structures and accountability. I'm not going to talk about this a lot. I think there's a lot of research out. Most countries invest a lot on this, perhaps more than they need to. I put this actually quite low in terms of impact. It is important, but not alone. More important is to invest resources where they yield most. One of the things, again, that have impressed me in the East Asian context is that they're often very, very good in attracting the most talented teachers and principals into the toughest schools. If you are, for example, in Shanghai in China, you're a vice principal in a high-performing school, and one day you say to yourself, I really want to become a principal. The government will tell you, well, that's a fantastic ambition. But first, help us turn around one of the most sort of schools in need. Same for the teachers. If you want to advance in your career, you only advance by taking on an extra challenge. In most of the countries, particularly in Europe, we're doing the reverse. We're getting the best teachers into the most privileged schools. And why does it make a difference? Actually, here on the horizontal axis, I show you not how much people invest in education, but how equitably they invest in education. I'm putting the countries that align the resources with the challenge in the green part, and the countries, which have basically a regressive approach to resources on the left side. And the sad part is the majority of countries are on the left side. You have a few countries that have become really, really good at this. What is the most impressive outcome from Finland in PISA? Not that the education system does well. That's also important, of course. Yeah. But the most impressive outcome is that only 5% of the performance variation in the student population lies between schools. Every school succeeds because every school knows what every other school is doing. That's a sort of system that has leveraged those kinds of resources. In most of the countries, we've got to do a lot better on those kinds of things. Finally, it's about coherence. Now, for policymakers, that's really hard. Whenever you have a new Minister of Education coming education, they want to do things differently. And they start to forget about the kind of things that have done before. It's about coherence across all aspects of the system, coherence over time. It's about fidelity of implementation, ensuring that intended policies translate into implemented policies and ultimately achieve policies. We're not doing really well on that. And this is about making change happen. We're not very good in inspiring education through research and science. Medicine spends about 15 times as much as education on the development of knowledge, on research, on innovation. We don't do much of this. If you think about the role of practitioners, who does research in medicine? It's not universities. It's mainly practitioners. How much research is done by teachers? Not very good in mobilizing the knowledge of practitioners and the users, students, parents. Where's the student voice? Finally, entrepreneurial development. I think that's what we're talking about here at this conference. But again, there is sort of the size of the industry is tiny compared with other fields of our societies. Markets are totally fragmented, segmented, overregulated. It's really, really hard to become an entrepreneur in the field of education, make a difference at scale. Those are the things that are really important. So let me summarize this. In the past, it was sufficient to educate a few people well. That's what the industrial age was about. Only some people needed to succeed. You needed lots of workers who do the job. Today, that doesn't work anymore. Today, we need to get every child to deliver high levels of learning outcomes. And that's precisely what the most advanced education systems show is possible. Every child can do well in mathematics. That's what you learn from Shanghai, from Finland, from those kinds of countries. We need to think that it's no longer about preparing students for a lifetime. It's about giving them the compass and the navigation tools to actually find their own way. It's about complex ways of thinking. It's about complex ways of walking. And the trick is that this demands a very different caliber of teachers. In the past, teaching was about standardization and compliance, telling people what to do in the classroom. Today, you really need to have a high caliber knowledge worker in the classroom. People who are able to connect, to collaborate with other people around the profession. And the difficulty is that those people don't like to work in Tayloristic work organizations, in the kind of industrial work organization that dominates our schools today. What they want is flat and collegial work organization with true and genuine career paths. And of course, that has implications on accountability. Today, we shouldn't just feed information upwards to the ministry. We should actually think better how we connect learners, teachers, parents, and everyone to build a global education community. Thank you very much.